Jim. Welcome to my Vigilance podcast. I'm delighted to have you. I was thinking as we were starting this, I've known you a long time. I'm not going to even say the number, but it was Steve Katz, our dear friend who passed recently, who was kind enough to introduce us and was a great mentor to both of us, and still is, right? A great memory to have, actually. So as we kick this off, I thought I would just pass it to you for an introduction.
Sure, Pam, and I'm happy to be here with you. And yeah, we have a lot of miles on our treads
We do.
together and respectively. So I am a former CISO and CSO at six different, primarily large financial service organizations. I served on the board of the FS-ISAC for many years. I served on the board of the Health ISAC for many years. And about 2.5 years ago, I decided to retire from active CISO roles, but I am a board member on a number of different boards. I am an advisor to about 20 different companies, both cybersecurity and IT companies. I teach cybersecurity at NYU, Tandon School of Engineering, and I mentor about 75 cybersecurity professionals. About 15 of them are CISOs. So I'm kind of at the point in my career where I work with people I like, present company included. I do the kind of work that I like to do, and I only work when I want to work. So it's a bit of a liberating experience compared to being a CISO, where you process information about do I have to act on this now, and you're doing that 24/7, protecting enterprise. I get to enjoy life a little bit more. So the most important card in my wallet these days is my library card, because I can read for leisure, which is a luxury that I enjoy.
That's so funny you say that because I wrote down all the things that I would do if I had more time, and reading was at the top of the list. And so, yeah, because I want to have a vision, right? But not living with that pressure of being a CISO is just, you probably sleep better at
I
night.
sleep a lot better. Sleep a lot better. No question about it.
There's no question. Well, today we're going to talk about not all security metrics are KPIs. You wrote a white paper on this that I thought was absolutely brilliant. Actually, I had a plethora of white papers to pick from, and this one stood out just because my CISOs ask me all the time about, do you have a technology solution that will help me measure my security program? And I don't, actually. And is metrics even the right word? And I think that's, the gist of our conversation today is, what is the difference between metrics and KPIs, and how should we be measuring our security program? And you were very bold in your statement about ignore cybersecurity metrics. I know that's contentious, so let's just start there, and I'll ask you why we should be ignoring metrics.
Yeah, it's a bit controversial, and it's not it's not meant to be anything other than a call to freeze what our norm is in terms of standard practices, and move to something that is better than our norm. So I'll be very specific. Um, I read, I would say, I'm guessing, 20 to 30 books on cybersecurity metrics. And so there's a lot of content out there. And I'm not a fan of security metrics. I am a big fan and an advocate for key performance indicators. Now, key performance indicators are metrics. So therefore, I endorse the notion of metrics. But there's a subset that really is what cybersecurity professionals should focus on. And that subset is the measurement of the health of the core process that has a control or several controls embedded within it. And that measure of that health does change over time, but you can get decisions made, and you can come to consensus on the allocation of resources to the highest priorities when you have the facts. And the facts are the process is healthy or the process is not healthy. The process is healthy but not as healthy as we want it to be, and we have a quantifiable numeric way of measuring the health. And that's what a KPI is. Now, I'm going to tell you a story that hopefully will give your audience the opportunity to avoid the scar tissue that I engendered in this particular case. So it was I think it was my second CISO gig. I was at DTCC, and I think that I was probably 3 to 4 months into my tenure, and it was one of my first security committee meetings. It might have been the second. I can't remember, so I had a security committee with the CEO and the CEO's direct reports, and I was going through metrics, and so I was saying that
Of course.
the number of vulnerabilities in our environment was initially 20,000, and it's now 80,000, right? And I was pleased with this as an outcome. But once again, the information that I just provided really needs some context, because the reason I was pleased is because I had implemented in that 4 month period of time a whole suite of tools that was measuring the cybersecurity vulnerabilities across the enterprise in different domains. And so we had a much better handle on what the real number was in terms of vulnerabilities. And that was what I was celebrating. But my CEO at the time said, "That's great, Jim. You've been here 4 months and you've quadrupled the number of security vulnerabilities in the enterprise. So listen, if I fire you today, does that mean that that number is going to stop growing?" Right? Because I'm contemplating that right now, right? So, context is everything. What I was basically proud of is that we could actually measure and see all these security vulnerabilities that were invisible previously. It's not that they weren't there, they just weren't visible. And so now we had a chance to take a look at them. But here's the point. The point is, I was using security metrics as measures because I could measure this information. But that's not the right measure. So, as an example, you're doing a podcast right now. I'm pretty certain that we can measure down to the seconds how much time it takes for us to produce this podcast, right? That's pretty easy to measure, right? Is that any indication of the quality of content that your members will get? And the answer is no, nothing.
No,
It
you're spot on.
doesn't matter how long it is. It matters how valuable the input is. And you can't measure that using a stopwatch, right? So we have a tendency in cybersecurity to measure things because we can. And it focuses critical resources on the wrong priorities, or it has that risk. So a better approach, an alternative approach, is to use metrics, but use the subset of metrics that are key performance indicators. And you only need one or two of those to measure the health of the underlying process. And if it's fact-based, then you're actually enabling the entire organization to make better decisions on what the risk priorities are and how to allocate resources. That makes sense?
It does make sense. And so, instead of saying we now have 80,000 vulnerabilities, you could say our process for fixing vulnerabilities is more efficient. We're getting into our patch window of critical vulnerabilities of 30 days. Or would that be an example of a
That's
process?
much closer to the health, because if there's 80,000 vulnerabilities, some number of those vulnerabilities are being created every day. Why? Because there's misconfiguration of technology assets. And that's essentially the root cause. So the cumulative effect is 80,000 vulnerabilities. But if you can get down to the root cause and stop new vulnerabilities from being introduced by
Oh,
changing a core
yes.
process, and then measuring the health of that core process continually, then not only does the number of vulnerabilities shrink, but the vulnerabilities created every day shrinks or goes to zero, and now you have a fighting chance to manage the remediation work that has to be done across the rest of the vulnerabilities. So
Right.
it's kind of like a surgeon saying, "Give me a clamp. I have to stop the bleeding now, and then I'll perform the right this surgery." Uh, and so to stop the bleeding now, what you really have to do is say, "Look, this is the health of the process that matters, and that's what we're going to measure. And then we're going to
Mhm.
find root cause for these vulnerabilities and fix that early in the life cycle at the root cause." Not only is that more effective, it's actually more cost effective to do it that way. So
Sure.
KPIs are foundational to being able to apply resources in an efficient and effective way.
So, is there, this is, it'd be really great if the answer was yes, but is there a list of KPIs like or processes we should be measuring, or are we just looking for problems and saying, let's figure out the root cause and get the process? I mean, because, so tell us how you come up with your list of
Yeah,
KPIs.
there is no magic list of KPIs. Uh,
I
all
was
right.
hoping, I just thought maybe I'd ask. Yeah.
No, but what there is something to avoid, and this goes back to the second biggest mistake that I made as a CISO, which is um, that I started getting input from my security committee stakeholders on what they would
Mm,
like to see measured. So, in this discussion where, the CEO basically said, "Jim, should I fire you now?" The, 80,000 vulnerabilities, it morphed into, well, maybe measure these things or maybe measure those things, right? And so I nodded my head, being a newbie and not knowing any better, and went ahead and put in place resources to produce those measurements. And within from within 6 months of that period, I had 4 people working part time to produce the content to give the information to the stakeholders. And it turns out, in retrospect, it was the wrong information. It wasn't even the right information. And so I was following the written material that I had read on security metrics and say, yeah, security metrics are good and give stakeholders what they want. And then it dawned on me, it's like, my stakeholders, they don't know anything about cybersecurity. So they're not really a good source of what the KPIs should be. So who is a good source? One default could be the CISO, but I'm not a big fan of that approach. And I learned what works more effectively is to have owners of processes within the cybersecurity organization and to ask them to come up with how they measure health of their core process and what the key KPIs are for their core processes. And it brings it to a level that's much more practical. And frankly, it turns out that the life of a KPI evolves. So, for example, there are implementation KPIs. What's an implementation KPI? If you want to put a control in place, there's some work to be done to implement that in the existing process. And the measurement of success is the control is implemented and operating or not. It's pretty binary. Now, once you've crossed the threshold and the control is operating, is it useful to tell you every month that the control is operating? Not necessarily, right? So that's an implementation KPI, but it's not measuring the health of the ongoing process. So I call those business uh, process KPIs or just run the business KPIs. And these are the KPIs that are ongoing processes. You're measuring them every day, every week, every month, whatever the appropriate frequency is. And you're capturing the health of the process at that snapshot in time. And the KPIs tend to be stable over a longer
mhm.
period of time. But even those KPIs may be replaced by more suitable KPIs as the process matures. So there is a life cycle to the KPIs, and the best people to decide the KPIs are the ones that are responsible and accountable for the core processes. And they're the ones that should identify. Now, the CISO can certainly have veto power or influence that. And frankly, the CISO, from my perspective, should have a data scientist that helps create the
Oh,
KPIs
yeah.
or a team of data scientists to do that. But essentially, the accountability should be with the program owner. The program owner is the one accountable for the effectiveness of the control. And they have to work with their colleagues on the operational processes that have to be mature and implemented to satisfy that the control works. And so that's really where the decision making belongs on identifying the KPIs. And then the CISO should curate KPIs for the senior executive team based on what topics are being covered. You know, so I used to publish somewhere between 200 and 400 KPIs across an enterprise. And
Wow.
but the point is that, if an auditor came in and said, "Well, how effective is your security program?" I could say to them, "Well, look at the KPIs. It's 400 of them. Good
Yeah.
luck. Have at it." Right. So that was useful, but I would never do that to the ELT, the executive leadership team. For them, I'd say, we're going to talk about this KPI this week because it's germane to some decisions that we have to make. Or we're going to talk about these three KPIs because they're tied to that policy decision we just made, right? So I'm going to curate a subset of KPIs for some rich discussion and decision making for the senior executives and even the board. But I'm the curator. I'm looking at my hundreds of KPIs and I'm saying, yeah, we're going to that one, and this one. That's what we'll talk about.
That's interesting. So, and you said across the organization. So that makes me think you're thinking outside of the security function, the formal cybersecurity function. Maybe you're looking into IT a bit. I know we in security we rely on our partners in IT to do a lot of things. So how far reaching are you into maybe other functional groups with these KPIs?
Yeah, so the KPIs they know no boundaries, certainly no organizational boundaries. And so I would harvest KPIs regardless of whether the part of the organization reported into cybersecurity or not. I was indifferent, agnostic to that. I was accountable as a CISO, and all CISOs are, for the resilience of the entire enterprise. And so if there was an HR function like doing background checks, I'd have a
Yeah.
KPI associated with that process. Now, the HR team that was managing the vendor who was producing the background check, they'd come up with the KPI, and as long as it was reasonable from my perspective, I'd encourage them to publish it, and we'd include it in our KPI count going forward. So we had, I don't know, maybe 30% of functions that were producing KPIs that were not reporting into the cybersecurity organization. But from a senior executive perspective, it really doesn't matter. What matters is the health of the controls, regardless of where they are. And the reality is about 70%, this is Jim's opinion, and can certainly be challenged, but about 70% of all the controls in the enterprise are largely controlled by the IT organization and how they deploy technology. And
Mhm.
so I would use KPIs for those just as much as I'd use them for the SOC operations, which typically did report to the CISO. So KPIs know no boundaries and should not be specific to one organization versus another organization. The beauty of them is they present facts on the health of the controls that you're dependent upon, and that gives an opportunity to anyone of saying, "Hey, what can we do to improve this?" Because The
Mhm.
results aren't necessarily where we want. They're not healthy enough. And then when you change and update processes, you introduce new KPIs that are more mature and much more effective. And that's an evolutionary cycle. So it really doesn't matter reporting relationships. What matters is that the facts are being served up for people to make the right decisions.
Right. So a few things that come out of it. It makes me think of the podcast I did with Shamla and I do recently about accountability and transparency. Right. Really, it's the CISO just in their role, whether it's they're relying on IT to patch or implement, operationalize a tool. At the end of the day, that accountability and that transparency has to be there, um, actually as part of the CISO role. And even though it does include reaching into some other organizations, at the end of the day, having a low number of vulnerabilities, for example, is your responsibility, but you own it with other functional groups. So it makes a lot of sense that the KPIs would cross boundaries. Um, I, I wonder how uncomfortable that could be at points in time, right? But if you're partnering with your orgs, it should be no problem at all.
That's exactly right. And look, there are always organizational conflicts and turf battles that take place. Um, but what permeates a lot of conflict is misinformation or the incomplete information. And a commitment to
Yeah.
KPIs suggests that the entire enterprise is consuming facts, and if that happens, the chances of the enterprise making the right decision over the long term is far greater than if the consumption of misrepresentations or inaccurate information fuels bad decisions. So essentially KPIs is the fact based a fact base that helps enable better decisions across the enterprise, regardless of how the organization is structured.
So Jim, with regards to being able to make these processes more transparent, you probably have to talk to your colleagues. For example, if it's an incident response process, you're collecting data from your peers or the leadership, and then documenting it. Are you manually documenting it? Is there some magic there around because it is hard to understand and document processes? Sometimes they're hard to see.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we typically, in the implementation of our KPIs, um, would forge consensus, and the processes were designed to forge consensus across organizational boundaries to really make better decisions on what the top priorities were. And so we had a data science team that worked with all of the program owners to help
Hmm.
refine and make sure that the KPIs were actually measuring the health of the core
That's good.
functions and the underlying controls. And that was available to anyone, regardless of the organization. And then we'd have a monthly uh, meeting where we'd go through all the KPIs, but we really wouldn't go through all the KPIs. We had all the KPIs published, and we had this concept of target KPIs. So a target KPI was kind of like a stretch goal, because you might say that we want uh, 98% of our devices to be deployed according to our standard build, uh, as a baseline. But we're going to shoot for 99%, and that's going to
Yeah.
be our target KPI. So the actual KPI was, here's how we did this month compared to our target KPI. And essentially, we would color code it, red, yellow, green. So if it was in, 98% and we're shooting for
Mhm.
99%, we'd say green or yellow, depending on whether there were issues. And the red KPIs were the ones that got the attention during the meeting, and rightly so, because it required us to take some action. And so the majority we'd all consume all the KPIs, but we wouldn't spend time on the green and even most of the yellows, we'd focus on the reds where we were even having implementation problems, or we had to change our approach or change something we're doing because the process that we were relying on was not healthy, and that means we have to take some action. But it was very much of a consensus building way of doing it, and the KPIs were presented by the product owners, and because they own, the program owners, they own the program, so they would present, and then everyone who participated, we probably had, I don't know, 60 to 80 people that attended this meeting
Wow.
monthly, and so everybody or anyone could voice a concern. Don't you think that's, the KPI should be higher, the target KPI should be higher, and the program owner will say, we thought about that, and you're absolutely right in pointing that out. But here's why we decided to, have it at this level, and this is our rationale. And what happens is everybody says, "Oh, okay, well that sounds, pretty reasonable." And so you forge consensus on what the health of
Mhm.
your core processes are, and if somebody needs help, people rush to the rescue, saying, "Red KPI,
Yeah.
all right, let's focus on this. What do we need to do? Well, here's what we did last week. That didn't work very well. Whose idea was that? That was Jim's. Okay, well, we won't do that this week. let's find
Yeah.
another approach and don't listen to Jim, right?" And so we try another approach. And so, the red indication was really an alert to the leaders to say, let's do something different, or let's try a different approach. But this outcome is not successful, so we have to make adjustments.
I love it because it's back to, I said this already, but accountability and transparency and also teamwork, which I haven't said, right? You're creating a culture of team, right? And we need that to fight the cyber war. We're so focused on technology and hiring more bodies or whatever it is, but we're not looking at, it's back to people, process, and technology. We're not looking at that process piece, which is so crucial to the outcome. And I just love it. I mean, I love this approach. And I guess I was just trying to, when I was asking some of my questions, I was trying to simplify it for somebody who's listening to us have this conversation on how can they implement this. And it's really, I think what you're saying is go to the program owners, whether they're in your functional group of cyber or not. If they have an impact on cyber, then they're part of this group, obviously, and ask them to create those KPIs and then report monthly. Am I saying this right?
Yep,
Report monthly on their
that's
progress.
exactly right.
And so that'd be the process that they would follow if they took this advice.
That's exactly right. And some
That's very
KPIs are you want daily. If you're running a SOC operation or identity access management operations center, but it typically weekly would be where outside people outside that process might review the KPIs, and monthly was mandatory. So every single function had to produce KPIs for consumption on a monthly basis. And again, we had a data science team dedicated to helping both improve the quality of the data as well as
yeah.
designing new KPIs for the future if necessary.
So not everybody has access to a data science team, or what are your thoughts there? And how many people did you have?
Yeah,
How many data?
there's a book
Yeah.
called "Algorithms to Live By," and if you're a cybersecurity professional, you want to read that book. If you're a data
Algorithms.
algorithms to live by,
Yeah.
and if you absolutely love that book, it's a short book too. It's not that hard. But if you love the book, if you love the logic, you love everything about it, you have the potential for being a data scientist, or at least at minimum, understanding data science fundamentals that can be applied to cybersecurity. So you're good. If you like it, that means that you have the potential to use the fundamentals. If you don't like it, that's okay, but then you're obligated to find a friend who loves it, because you won't be successful long term if you don't
Yeah.
understand data science. Data science is foundational to cybersecurity, and it's always been foundational to cybersecurity, largely because we need to move away from people making decisions on how to apply a control, as an example, providing access to something. And we have to rely on behavioral data to
Yes.
identify deviation to trigger automated workflow. And that's how we make
Mhm.
things much more efficient and effective. And that's how we bring data science into the front line of cybersecurity controls, where it's not dependent upon a human. Because humans, they're wonderful, except they don't work all the time. They take PTO, they go to Europe on vacation, and God bless them, they deserve it. But the fact is,
Mhm.
running an operation that's dependent upon a person making a decision is more of a liability than it is an asset. And so a better
Mhm.
model is to push as many transactions through automation by using data models, essentially machine learning algorithms, to drive frontline security controls, and then have your security professionals step back, look at the transactions, and make adjustments. And essentially, they become analysts. And what are they analyzing? Data, which is why data
Yeah.
science is foundational cybersecurity. If I only applied data science in identity access management, there are over 300 use cases that we can
Yeah.
deploy data science to make identity access management both more effective and a higher capacity to produce. And those are really good things over the long term from an economic standpoint. Like CFOs like being able to produce more with less, right? And this can be done through
Yeah.
data science. So data science is foundational to cybersecurity. KPIs are the measurement of the health of the processes and the controls that you're putting in place. So those things go together.
They go together. It's a super important point, and we got to it a little bit later in the podcast. But and anybody who said so, if you improve your processes, you need less labor.
That's true.
And so, if you need less labor, you can afford a data scientist or two
But
or 10
it's
or
exactly
however many you need.
data
In other words,
scientists
there's an
will they will pay for themselves. Believe
they
me.
will pay for
Yeah.
themselves. Because the first thing I thought was when you said that is how many of my CISOs have a data science, somebody from a data science team or access to data scientists. But if you improve your processes, you'll have your labor costs will go
We'll
down
go.
and you can afford data
Yeah,
scientists. So no, I
absolutely.
really kind of dig that.
First
Yeah. And the
first
data
person
scientists,
I
the
hired
underpinning.
at when I was at Aetna was a chief data scientist. First person I hired at Mass Mutual was a chief data scientist. First person that I hired, without a
Wow.
doubt.
That's amazing. And interestingly enough, having I've been in cyber 24 years, and I've not had this data scientist conversation until today. So I think if I'm learning, I know a lot of people are learning from this. The underpinnings of a good process, right? Identifying the underpinnings of a good process requires data science. And if you master that, the efficiencies of the organization just go through the roof. And we're so focused on technology, but we need to be focused on process as well. I mean, I'm not saying we can't do it without technology, but so this is just a fabulous conversation. I know I've learned a lot. Is there any final thoughts?
Sure. Where do you start with this? You start with
Yeah.
recognizing that better decisions come from the consumption of fact. And fact, as we've learned today in our societies, is more difficult to come by. So, um, you have a far greater chance of getting consensus on an improvement to an existing process if you're operating with facts. KPIs are fact based by design. They're facts.
Yeah.
This process is being measured in terms of its health at this moment in time this way. And that gives us an opportunity to say, yep, thumbs up, no, nothing required, or, that's not the result that we're after. Let's talk about
Yeah.
some changes and how can we help the owner implement the changes necessary.
Yes, I love it. It's just great. I really appreciate your time, Jim, today, and um, I know that our entire community can take away something from this, including not focusing so much on metrics, right? We are very focused on that and focusing more on KPIs and how to get there. You gave very succinct details about how to get there, and I appreciate that. And also I just love the teamwork that would come out of it as well. So thank you very much. I'm look forward to having you back on the podcast soon.
Thank you, Pam. I appreciate it.